good time today. I always like coming out and I appreciate Kelly Coles and the whole organization here that the School Board Leadership Council represents. And very excited because I think it's important that school board members be empowered and have an understanding of issues. And one of the things I'm going to say right before I even get started in this is there's a lot of variation in Ohio. School districts can vary tremendously based upon the leadership of individual school boards and, quite frankly, the individual socioeconomic situation, obviously, property tax value, everything else. So sometimes I want to be careful not to overdraw the conclusions to the point where it looks like everything is too simplified. So there are some nuances in here, but there's some very important core messages that I think cut to the core of what we want board members to be able to understand from a policy level. And what we are talking about is the dire fiscal straits of Ohio schools, and we need to put that in the context of why it matters. When school districts have challenges, what does that mean to the taxpayers in their individual areas? Buckeye Institute, which is where I work now. How many of you know about the Buckeye Institute? Several, about half of you. We are, just for the other half that's not as familiar, we are a nonprofit 501c3 think tank. We do public policy research. I'm engaged in both research and a certain level of government affairs to the extent that we educate and work with members on policy issues. We don't lobby on specific bills, so we don't say, pass this bill, don't pass this bill, but we can tell people when we think there's a good idea or not a good idea and respond to certain things and do some research for members of the General Assembly. And we have good relationships with quite a few members of the General Assembly, so I kind of split my time between the research side and that other side as well. Interestingly enough, I was recently a political candidate myself, and I found out just how hard it is. So for everybody who runs the school board, I was a candidate in Columbus for Columbus City Council, and that's a whole other world, and it's interesting to say the least. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started here. Obviously, Ohio school districts, they continue to seek levies to plug oftentimes structural problems that you have within your individual district. The problems, again, as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, vary greatly from a district-to-district basis. But one of the things that we at the Buckeye Institute have consistently said for a number of years, and we're a little bit famous for being the salary database folks, there's several other groups now that do it. The Treasurer of State picked up after us. There's another think tank now that does it. I think you'll hear from one of their representatives later today, Opportunity Ohio. But we started with the salary. So we put every teacher's salary in the state of Ohio. We get the information from the Ohio Department of Education, and we put it up on our own website, searchable database format. You can look up names, you can look up the year. We think that's important. It's not, in and of itself, it's not the be-all, end-all. You're seeing salaries, what does that mean? There's a lot of work that has to be done. You have to do a little bit of legwork to figure out what is the comparisons, how do you compare that, what does it mean? I mean, if somebody's making $70,000 a year, does that mean anything? You may know the person, you may not know the person. So, you know, we're going to be working with our own databases to improve some of the comparison information so that you can take a look at that and put it in context and understand what that salary means. But we think it is important because that's ultimately taxpayer dollars, whether it's the state dollars or whether it's the local dollars. So it makes a great deal of difference to understand. So here's the thing. We think the total compensation packages, oftentimes of the teachers, subject to collective bargaining agreements, which practically every school district, obviously in the state of Ohio, has, is a big, though not the only driver of recurrent shortfalls for the school districts in Ohio. A key point to that is that while the school teacher salaries have a tendency to constantly inflate due to the nature of the collective bargaining agreements, the private economy in Ohio has not been doing well for a long period of time. And actually, the median pay in Ohio is declining when you compare it to the rest of the country. This is a chart. We do a monthly report at the Buckeye Institute where we look at the health of Ohio's private economy. And what March 2000 represents, that 4.85 million is the peak private sector employment for Ohio. So that was when we had the most people employed in the private sector in Ohio. And we are now, in August, the latest numbers that we get from the U.S. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, we have 4.45 million people in the private sector.
Those are people working. What is the total population of Ohio?
It's about 10. It's a little around, yeah, a little over 10 or so. And again, this is private sector. There are we pull out. There's around 700 or so thousand folks I think, that work in the government. That includes state government, that includes the local governments, the people who are full-time employed in cities, things like that. We pull that out because we believe at the Buckeye School, we're a free market think tank, we believe that the private sector is the better indicator of the overall health. A lot of times you see the unemployment numbers, you see that, you'll see the government jobs are included in that, and that's certainly a way to look at it, but government is inherently, to a certain extent, parasitic, to the extent it's needed, and I'm not here saying it's not needed, obviously, but it can't exist without those revenues that are derived from the private sector. So that's what we try to take a look at. Today, again, this is as of August, which is the latest numbers from BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics. There are 388,000 fewer private sector workers that are supporting. Ohio's government has shrunk in the last few years. And so I do want to be candid. There's been some level, there's been some shrinkage. We hear a lot about it in the press. I'm sure you hear about it in your local newspapers all the time. Firefighters, the police, whatever kind of folks are being layoffs or things like that. So there has been some reduction in the government workforce. I will say that the government workforce had not seen any significant reductions for years. And so as the private sector had stagnated and declined dramatically, and it's important to understand that between 2000 and 2010, especially when you look at the Great Recession, we lost more private sector jobs than any other state in the country except our neighbors up north, Michigan. Michigan lost 700,000+ private sector jobs. We lost nearly 619,000 private sector jobs. And the government stayed very static. So we have quite frankly, a near cataclysmic decline in Ohio's private sector. And even on some of the jobs that we're getting back, it's in different type of industry sectors, and it's a much different type of workforce that Ohio is beginning to develop now, and that's something that the state's going to have to deal with. But government stayed fairly strong. The point of this is just to say there's less people working in the private sector to pay for a government that is, in many respects, largely the same as it has been. And in fact, many people, I think, would argue that it is probably somewhat bloated, and so that even with some of this small decline that we've seen, it's still on the top side and much larger than is perhaps necessary. Another important thing to understand about Ohio's economy, which gets us to all the issues with taxpayers, is the labor force is declining. And the labor force is actually not only the people that are working, but people who are looking for work. The unemployment rate is basically people who have a job, and then the people who are out of a job but are looking for work that don't have one. That's how you get the, whatever we're at now. I think we're at 7.3 right now, unemployment rate, which is at the national average for the unemployment rate in Ohio. And that's actually considered good because we've been seeing a decline of the unemployment. We actually were above the national average. We were below the national average in terms of, it was like 8 something and we were in the 7s for a long time. Now we're right at the national average. So our economy seems to be stalling to some extent. And our unemployment rate has not continued its decline. But here's a real problem. The labor force, again, only captures people who are looking for work. If a person drops out of the labor force, that means they're no longer looking for work. Now, some of that is retirements. There's a big demographic shift going on in the country, and Ohio's no different. People are retiring because of the baby boomers. And so there's going to be, to some extent, we would expect that the labor force is going to have a certain amount of shrinkage just because of that. It does not appear, however, that that is the main driving force behind what is happening in Ohio, which is since January of 2000, we've lost nearly 100,000 people, 95,000 people out of the labor force. And actually, we had a 32 consecutive months between March of 2010 and December of 2012 of consecutive losses in the labor force. Now, sometimes this was only a few hundred, maybe upper hundred, maybe 1,000, something like that, and it would fluctuate, but it was consecutive months of shrinkage instead of consecutive months at stability or increases. You would expect and want your labor force to be increasing, and you would want your unemployment rate to be going down with an increasing labor force, because that shows that the economy is doing well, because it means that the labor force is strong, and it means that the people who are looking for work are in fact finding it. Part of the reason our unemployment rate is so low now is not because people are finding work, but because people are not finding work and are just getting frustrated and dropping out. So again, and we lost 24,000 in July and August. I think it was about 11,000 and 13,000. 11,000 in July and 13,000 or so in August. So there are some real challenges that we have in our labor force, and this means that Ohio's economy is still having challenges. That gets us to the schools. Well, actually, let me continue to tell you a little bit more about how bad the economy is. In fact, 2012 median income, according to the Census Bureau, is 15% below the national median, which is 51,000. So, jobs going down, incomes are not staying strong, and when you do an inflation adjustment, we actually have seen a decline adjusted from where we were at in 2000. Again, fairly substantial. If you adjusted it, you'd be at about 56,000. So, Ohio really isn't doing that well. It's seen some moderate improvement in the last few years. I do think the governor deserves some credit, or a good deal of credit for certain things that helped out, but we shouldn't overdraw the conclusion and think that we're out of the woods. We have stopped digging the hole. We were digging a hole, we stopped it, so now we're in a situation where we're kind of climbing up. I don't even think it's fair to say that our head is popped up out of the hole yet. We're still in the hole, we're just not quite as deep. So I think it's very important to understand that. And then look at this. According to the Ohio Department of Taxation, we have the 6th highest local tax burden as a percentage of personal income in Ohio. So in terms of what people are making, we pay a higher percentage than most other states in the country, just at the local level. And there's a whole host of problems with local taxation. Obviously, part of it deals with directly schools, but we've got income taxes, sometimes for schools, certainly in municipalities as well. What all of this means is that each new levy keeps the burden, at least the same burden of that taxation, or increases that burden. And you're increasing the burden on an already beleaguered population. People probably don't have work, or they're underemployed, and they don't have the same type of income situation. So that means you better be very careful, and I think you do see that as you see the levy passage statistics on the new levies and things like that. Because you're seeing the background effect of all these economic situations are very pertinent in people's minds. They are very sensitive to all of these conditions and how they combine for them. This is a chart that we had done in 2010. And what this is we aggregated the ending balance. We used a 5-year forecast that ODE does. We looked at the ending balance 5 years out, and then we totaled that for each county. So for every school district that was in a county, we took their aggregate ending balances and found out, are they in a surplus or are they in a deficit? Everything that's red is, well, most everything actually is a deficit of some level or another. The red is the higher ones. The only ones that are actually surpluses are the blue ones. So there was an aggregate deficits across the state using, again, October 2010 5-year forecasts. There was a cumulative deficit, and I'll get to that here. And I can send anybody who wants this to PowerPoint so you can look at it a little bit more. These are projections. Now I do want to say we need to be careful with these 5-year projections. You have to monitor the assumptions that are put into these projections. And obviously there's a lot of unforeseen things that can happen in the time period. I mean, we now have, back in 2010, we really had the natural gas explosion that we're starting to see in terms of property values in certain parts of the state are actually increasing at a fairly decent clip because there's natural gas being found. If we do start finding oil, they haven't found a lot of oil yet. It's mostly a natural gas play in the Utica Shale. If they start finding oil, that's going to be massive. You've probably seen the stories of how much Ohio could gain that way. That could change a 5-year forecast to the positive. Very positive on the property because it increases your property valuation. So you got to look at that. These 5-year forecasts also, sometimes some school districts will, they assume the numbers that the levy isn't going to pass, even a renewal levy won't pass, so that'll obviously decline the revenue in there and make it look a little bit worse. They will make assumptions about what they are going to do with their collective bargaining agreements, and so they may assume higher savings than what you are really going to get when you sit down and you do the brass tacks of negotiation, and that may show personnel costs being a little bit lower. So I only say this, the 5-year forecasts are very important. Every school district wants to look at them. You want to understand all of it. But when we look at the aggregate deficits, that is helpful, but it's not gospel either. Because, and we've even found this when we look back, we did the same exercise using May 2012 numbers, and we did the same thing. We aggregated it was a $7 billion cumulative statewide deficit using those October 2010 projections. When we came back and used projections in May of 2012, which got us into the year 2017, the deficit was small by less than half, 2.7. Now, there's a lot of things that happened in that area. You had Senate Bill 5, so you did have some collective bargaining modifications and some, I would say some of it wasn't done necessarily in the best of faith and things like that, but during that heated political environment, we did see certain things happen. Unions wanted to say we can negotiate, we can do well, you don't need Senate Bill 5, so we're going to take these concessions and things like that. So there was a little bit of that played into it. Again, you're starting to see some of the property valuations go up as the natural gas play hits, and there's, districts pass levies, and that changes things as well. So again, that's why I want to always be cautious, and I want to say don't overdraw the conclusions, but understand what they mean and just keep in the back of your mind some of that. 2010, Cuyahoga County was by far the worst county in the state. It had a when you added up all the districts within Cuyahoga County and you looked at their ending balances, they had a $1 billion cumulative deficit. Using just this past October, which is the latest 5-year projections, they do them in May and October. I'm not sure if all of you may already know that, but you submit each year. You submit it in May and you submit it in October, a 5-year projections to ODE, so it's done twice a year. So in October 2013, the cumulative deficit is $238 million, so that's for all. And most of that's Cleveland, unsurprisingly. A good chunk of that is Cleveland. I mean, it's probably 200 million of that is Cleveland alone. So Cleveland, and this is after they passed their levy, I might add. So 5 years out, they're still expecting to have massive, massive deficits. We also decided we wanted to take a look and say, well, how do we get, the 5-year forecast can give you something to be aware of and be cautious about, but what's your relative health at any given moment in time? So we try to look at the structural deficit or surplus, which is essentially your revenues over expenditures. And so we looked at the statewide, and we looked at the last 3 years, and what we basically did is using actual numbers. In this case, these weren't projections, but these were using fiscal year 2012 numbers. What we did is say, aggregate all of the surpluses and deficits, add them all up for every school district in the state, and what is do we have a deficit or do we have a surplus? As it turns out, there was a surplus in 10, 11, and 12, but the surpluses vary. And again, this gets to the point that there's a great deal of variation in your individual districts. But that said, think about this, 65.9, nearly 66 million, there's over 600 school districts. That means there's only, if you average it out, there's about $100,000 playroom in each one of the districts. For some districts that might be meaningful. Some districts that means that the very next year you're about likely to go off into a chasm somewhere. And of course there's going to be some bigger districts that are way, way off the wall in that. And so this is something where you've got to watch those structural things. You've got to watch in each individual district. So when you're looking at the districts, you've got to be sure we understand where you're at, and is there a trend of, are you staying in your surplus, or when do you start hitting those negative numbers? So again, we try to look at all these numbers, we try to look at it at a statewide basis, but one of the real challenges is you've got so much variation in these individual districts that it can kind of show you where maybe a very general trajectory, but you want to be very careful that you don't assume just because that's a general trajectory that necessarily applies to your individual area, because it could be completely different. We have some school districts that do things incredibly. Some people, like Ms. Coles in the back there in Springboro, are able to do levies with a reduced millage rate to be able to do basically income, getting taxes back to people, because they managed to manage their collective bargaining agreements and issues like that in a very proactive, good way. And we have some districts that capitulate every single time. So again, one of the themes I guess I keep hitting here is there's so much variation that it's hard to look at the aggregate numbers and really get the best overall snapshot, because it can be very different at your own local level. One thing I also want to say is you hear all the time about, the state is cutting back. State hasn't, they haven't filled things up. We're not seeing the state money. And darn it, we're always doing levies because the state just isn't doing enough. They haven't met their obligations under the Roth decision, which was the case that went to the Supreme Court back in the 90s, early 2000s, dealing with the constitutionality of the state education system. But if you look, the state of Ohio, using its combined state resources, this doesn't look at the federal dollars that come in, we've actually increased over inflation. Red line's inflation, the blue line is the actual spending. And you'll see that in the Roth era, which was again in the 90s, we start to see a significant amount of separation in the amount of money that's spent. Now we do see, and this is where people are starting to talk, a lot of groups want to criticize the Kasich administration, the current General Assembly, because there is a decline here at the end of the Strickland era in state money, in raw state GRF. So there's raw state dollars did actually decline for a couple of years. But what a lot of people won't say is that it was backfilled at the time because that was also the time for the federal stimulus and the whatever that was, the RI dollars, the reinvestment and whatever act that was called.
Like the TARP?
No, the TARP was before that. This was literally the stimulus, the multi-billion-dollar. We're going to have all the shovel-ready jobs. We're going to get all this stuff in. So there was a great deal of federal money that came into the state of Ohio, and the districts did get. And so what the Strickland administration did is they actually reduced to a certain extent the state resources because they were stretched then. We were losing all those jobs. The state taxes weren't coming in. So they did that, and what they basically said was, well, we'll backfill it eventually. Well, the governor Kasich didn't. He actually increased the state. In fact, every year that Governor Kasich has been in office, they have increased state spending to the schools. He did not, however, compensate for the full loss of the federal stimulus dollars. And here's an example. In just this next budget, when you combine the lottery, the projected lottery profits, which are that's about 6 or 7% of the money that goes into the state pot that's then distributed to schools, the state's actually spending $2.1 billion over the course of the next biennium than in fiscal year 12 and 13. And in fiscal year 12 and 13, I forget off the top of my head, but they spent more than they had spent in the last year of Strickland in state dollars. So I bring this up because I want to make it clear the state is, you can always dispute how much money is enough and all of this, and some people will never be satisfied unless the state does everything, and kind of like a socialist paradise or something, the state spends everything and everybody's equal. But the state has been trying very hard, I think, to spend a reasonable amount of money, and it does increase the amount, and it does the way that it spends the money. It spends it on wealth. It takes a serious look at all the property values and everything else. So it spends more in districts that have an inability to be able to raise as much money at the local level, and that's in an effort to be more equitable. So the state does do a pretty good job from our standpoint, perhaps even more than it needs to do, we would argue. Yes?
Rick, I just got elected on the school board, and one of the things I was fighting was the administration and treasurer that was saying the reason we need to pass this levy is because the state is giving us less funding. And he goes on to explain to everybody that the state's giving us less funding. You just said something opposite though.
We are spending, well, there are, here's where we get to some of where their critiques are, is this very next slide. So it's a good timing for your question. First of all, the federal stimulus dollars were significant. We would argue that the districts anticipated, I think, that the state would backfill, or that the feds would continue to do it at some point. That didn't happen fully. They wanted the full amount. They're, I think, disappointed, many folks are, that didn't occur. What they're also going to talk about is there is an issue where there was reimbursement from the state for the loss of tangible personal property tax. This was a tax reform from the mid-2000s, and it was phased out because of business considerations. This was a very massive tax reform, the largest that we've seen probably in a generation. Well, some districts get practically nothing from tangible personal property tax. It depends. Do you have a big warehouse in your district, or something where there's a lot of goods there that have historically been taxed? Well, this was going to be phased out, and there was a certain period of time that the state was going to reimburse at various percentages. There's a declining rate of reimbursement, and eventually it was always going to be phased out. Everybody knew it was going to be phased out eventually. The administration did a more rapid phase out. Now, they still spent more GRF and total state dollars in the general education, but they did cut a little bit back on by more rapid phase out of the personal property reimbursement, because the reimbursement rate wasn't what fit in directly into the state foundation formula that they spent. So there are going to be some districts where, admittedly, there's going to be less revenue because of that issue. But this is really a philosophical argument that folks can have. If you knew you were going to be losing this over time, should you have been banking that funding that you were getting for a period of time so that you were able to withstand it? Yes, they did a more rapid phase out than you might have anticipated. So that was a bit of changing horses in midstream, candidly. That said, you knew it was eventually going away. Why didn't you put this aside, do something with it, be more fiscally responsible at the time, so that if something were to happen, you were able to absorb those shocks? So I would submit that there is some room for some criticism, but overall I would say that fiscally prudent, it would have made sense that it's not like this thing was a brand new issue. You had no idea you were going to eventually go out. It was eventually going to go away. So that's a key thing. So that's really what the narrative of this slide is, which is, again, they knew it. If you were going to be proactive, be proactive.
Since we're talking about criticism, can you talk a little bit about the shell game with promoting the lottery, to sell the lottery?
Oh.
Well, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, the one's supposed to go to the schools,
They
and
do.
it's a trade-off.
Technically.
And probably the same thing is going to happen with the gaming thing.
Well, what you're talking about is
Yeah, the
lottery
casinos.
smash. Right. The lottery money, in essence, yes, they put the lottery, the proceeds into education, but then they
took
cut the
away
money
from
away from other revenue sources. That's probably, to some extent, that's probably true. That typically happens.
Is that going to happen here in casinos?
Depends on the nature of the leadership, but I've been around the State House long enough to think that that's not an unreasonable thought to have. Now, they're not going to, it's not going to be an aggregate cut, but the question is it more money or is it going to stay? Now, I will say they've been increasing the money that they have been putting in. I mean, the General Assembly did appropriate more money, and so they have made that commitment.
Well, you have that with the state going on. You have the federal, any federal money is associated with strings attached.
Yes.
So, I mean, you got government at both levels kind of playing games.
Well, and it's very difficult to navigate that. I mean, again, no, you're right, and that is one of the challenges that board members have, is that you do have the federal strings attached. If you, I know you've talked about Common Core. I think it's one of the things. You've got the race to the top dollars that came into the state. That's obligated us on the Common Core side of things, depending on what happens and changes.
And you got the state cutting back local government, county and local, so they have more money needs. So now you've got communities that have local government needs as well as the education needs.
Yes, and that actually is why we get to the collective bargaining agreement, so we get to the cost side of the ledger. One thing.
That's one side, but there's
Well, there's the revenue side and there's the expenditure side. There's both.
Right.
And I think that it's fair to say that the administration, and on this I would say that we at the Buckeye Institute largely agree with this general assessment that the administration has, which is the LGF and the amount of money that the state spends, in fact, not even in the LGF, but in what ODOT does for roads and a variety of other things, the state does an awful lot of subsidization of local government, as it is. Are they cutting back some of that? Yes. Some people will consider that a shell game. I understand where that concern comes from, but they're going to say that we've been spending more than we should have been spending all along, and we're trying to recalibrate for a new time period, and the local governments are going to have to decide how they want to do things. They would also argue that Senate Bill 5 was one of the toolkits that would have been able to be used to address some of these issues. We know how that ended up, but that's one of the issues, which actually is kind of a segue into one of the drivers that is an issue. Yes.
But being Buckeye Institute, it would help people like myself if, I know you put a lot of charts out there on the Buckeye Institute, if there was a chart that showed by district how much was lost, or maybe you already have that out there, how much was lost in the way of state funding, or how the state funding is done over the years. So, and maybe we look at the same with the gambling. I know it's just starting, but the kind of monies that the school is getting versus expected to get. Just to take out some of this, I mean, my school has a $3 million deficit and they're blaming it on the state. And they're just using the state as a scapegoat, in my eyes, because I don't think I think you just added that there's a lot to that. So if there's any kind of tools out there, I would appreciate it.
Well, I think that one of the things, an ODE, believe it or not, everything we get is actually out there on the Ohio Department of Education website. Now, they don't necessarily have everything in nice graph form, but they are actually doing a pretty good job of giving you some numbers. All the forecasts are out there. And you can actually see the line items on the tangible. I believe there's even There's even the line in 5-year forecast for your tangible personal property tax. This is my time limit?
10 left for questions or...
Gotcha. Now I better hurry up. Now, all right. Well, can I come back to you and I'll go through real quickly here so I kind of explain here. One, collective bargaining, we've kind of alluded to it, so you can kind of figure that that's a significant issue. We were using, back in 2010, we were looking again at those forecasts. When you look at the compensation, both the salaries and then also the insurance and the pensions, which obviously is part of your total compensation package, the statewide average was 96% of school districts' revenues would be absorbed by total compensation package. Now again, that's the statewide average. Some districts are going to be lower, some districts are going to be higher. In fact, there were numerous cases where over 100%, when you go 5 years out, of the total compensation packages were going to be nothing but personnel costs. So obviously you're going to have to raise taxes or cut those compensation costs in order to get those in line, because you can't spend more than you actually physically have, unless you're the federal government. This issue continues to happen. There are school districts that continue to, when you look at them, they start to move right up into the higher levels of the compensation side of what is a percentage of their revenue. This is a little bit complicated, so I'm going to try to go through it fast. We can talk a little bit more about it perhaps offline. The Ohio Department of Education does a very good job of breaking down districts according to various typologies. This is a way to try to compare as much of an apples-to-apples comparison of districts. So it's not fair to compare Columbus or Cleveland to Springboro, or to compare it to a school district probably in Benton County or something like that. It's just not, you got to do it. So there's basically 8 different typology codes. The rural, the small town, suburban, urban are the major overarching group. But then there's different types of things. You got your student poverty level, and population are major driving issues. Is it rural? Is it urban? Is it suburban? And then what is the poverty level? Because some suburban districts have a higher proportion of those in poverty than other suburban districts. So they're trying to give you an apples to apples so you understand these school districts and can make some comparisons across those. Again, this actually comes straight from the Ohio Department of Education website. It's a screenshot. So what we did is we looked at a district that is as close to the median per pupil spending for each one of those typologies. And then we looked at the median teacher salary within that district, and we compared that to the median taxable income. Now, there's a few issues here. You can get the fiscal year salaries from the Ohio Department of Education, and then using the CUP reports on the Ohio Department of Education website, which is an incredible tool that everybody should go and check out, because it's a great way to compare your district to other districts. And it's all right there. It looks at your incomes, your property values, and you can do all kinds of stuff with it. Again, it's the CUP, called the CUP report.
One more time, what is it?
CUP report, C-U-P-P, the CUP report. It's named after a former state senator and actually former Supreme Court Justice, Robert Cupp, did it, and it's an incredibly good thing. And so they have the taxable income, but they only have the taxable income for 2010. So there's a few issues there. They're not able to get the taxable stuff because they get that from their Ohio Department of Taxation. So there's some issues with the timing of how they get their data, and then we pull the data from them. But here's the point of this story: is the purple line is the teacher median salary in a representative district from each one of the typologies versus the median income of a person. Now, agreed, you could have 2 income households. This is one person, filers, tax filers in the Department of Taxation. But this is the median income for an individual tax filer in each one of these areas. And you can see, essentially, you can see the difference. And we prefer looking at median than average, because average has a tendency to sometimes, you have 1 or 2 outliers and it can really up or lower your average. So the median is a much better snapshot of looking at what is a true representation of that district. Obviously, there's going to be those that make a lot more. I mean, if you've got a median, for example, again, Centerville, that's a suburban district, and you'll see a lot of different ones, but that means half the people actually make more than that. Half the people make less, but half the people make more than that. The next slide. This isn't, I don't think this is as helpful as the median, but we wanted to get the administrator salaries, and you can't get the administrator median salaries through the Ohio Department of Education. And unfortunately, I didn't have time to put the whole thing together for this particular presentation. That's something we probably are going to try to do at some point. But you can get the average administrator salary from the Ohio Department of Education. And so the red line on this graph is the district administrator average salary. These are the same districts as were in the previous slide. and then the district classroom teacher average. This is the average as opposed to the median teacher salary, and then the district average income. Again, all this is basically from the CUP report. You can obtain all this information for yourself from the CUP report.
And the CUP report is accessible from what website?
That's through the Ohio Department of Education. But if you do a Google report, CUPP report, ODE, you should go straight to the link because it's kind of hard to navigate from the front page of ODE. But yeah, the issue here is you've got administrators that do tend to make more, and you've got teachers that tend to make substantially more than the people who comprise the leader tax base that we're talking about at the initiation point of this presentation. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. This is actually 5-year forecasts, and what we do is we look at the revenues. This is the revenues are the red line, the expenditures are the green line, your cash balances, and then the percentage of personnel costs as a percentage of revenue. And we did this for each one of the individual districts. So you can kind of see where you see your personnel costs starting to move up. There's a few caveats with this information. I'll get to that at the end. Probably since we're running out of time, I've got one for each one of these districts. So I don't know if I have time to actually show you each one, but I've got the presentation there. You can take a look at them. If you want me to email them to you, we'll probably try to put this online. So we did this for each one of the 8 districts. Dayton was a little quirky because cities, the way they do their expenditures has a lot to do with charter schools and money that's deducted for vouchers and various other things, and that's included in a different expenditure category because of the way that it works. It's sort of an accounting thing. So it lowers the actual cost when you look at the percentage of revenue, the expenses and personnel costs, but that's not really the revenue that they expect to keep to educate the children that are remaining in their district. So we actually performed a calculation where we removed the money that was deducted from them for these other issues. Again, the students' open enrollment, charter schools, STEM schools, and also for like Ed Choice, the voucher and the various scholarships. So we could get a more accurate, it's a little rough, but a more accurate assessment. And again, this actually means that the red line is better at showing what are the personnel that's still within the school district versus the expenses that they have for the students that are still in the district. Again, there's variation here. And so one of the things I do want to say is if you look at the revenues, you'll see declines in some of the 5-year forecasts, and some of those declines probably are levies that are expiring within the 5-year forecast period. And the key thing is, though, the renewals of many of these levies would do a pretty big job on those districts that are seeing cash balances really erode. Renewals probably would, they may not resolve everything, but they would ameliorate some of those issues. Renewals obviously are different than the replacements and new levies, and that's why the collective bargaining thing comes back in, because compensation reform is essential even in the well-managed districts. I always like to point out teachers are in fact well compensated as it is. We've talked about the graphs there on the actual median salary, and despite what they say, and some people get mad when the Buckeyes brings this up for other people, that they work less number of days per year. It's due. Their agreements, they actually, between your winter break and your spring break and your professional days and the month and a half to 2 months you get off in the summer, they're not analogous to what you see in most other jobs. So they are actually very well compensated when you factor that in. Even with the pension changes that we're seeing, as there have been some pension changes, that's actually another issue that has ameliorated some of the deficit issues.
That is pretty significant.
The teachers are retiring. Older teachers who've been around for a while are retiring to lock in their pension before some of the full changes to the pension systems are in. So you're actually seeing a bit of a generational shift in your teaching structure. So there is that is also an issue, and that's actually redounding to the benefit of school districts. And from a financial standpoint, we can argue on the other side of the ledger, but from a financial standpoint, it's unambiguously a positive thing in that sense to the district. But even with those changes, the pensions are still very solid pensions. They're defined benefit pensions, not 401ks like in the private sector. And though we are seeing some unions do a little bit of negotiation on the rate that they're spending on the contribution by the individual teachers to their insurance, still, that's around 20% is a rough guess, and it is a rough number from Kaiser Health and other groups of what a private sector person would pay for their insurance plan. Oftentimes you see 10% is what is a teacher union. Now it can vary, again, this is part of the collective bargaining agreement, and it can vary, but you're gonna have pulling teeth to get up to 15%. And I'm sure there's somebody out there that may have 20% cost sharing, but I don't think there's that many school districts that do. Really? Very
We
impressive.
got to 20 when Senate Bill 5 came through, they came in, they took a freeze, we managed to get 20%. They put a cap on it at 20, and now with the rate of insurance going up, we're down to 17.4, I think, percent the teachers pay. So that's what the cap equates to.
Right. But there is an example actually of an interest of actually a negotiation that probably moved in a better direction and was a pretty good negotiation, at least from the very quick description that you gave. But that is not the case in many situations. So don't forget, when there's the negotiations there's a lot of benefits that are there, and there's a lot of things that unions do to try to push back on that. But it's very important that they be reviewed. School boards need to maintain the control over that, negotiate aggressively. The freezes are not always enough. You got to, step increases and things like that. Eventually, you got to look at these things, the longevity, the step increases. We got to look at pay for performance eventually, and these kind of issues, because that are the kind of things long term that we need to do. Now, some of that's going to have to be state-based stuff too, but you can modify some. Cleveland, for example, though, interestingly enough, has implemented a point system as opposed to straight longevity. They are starting to do this. Now, they had some quirky things happen because they had a specific bill passed just for that one district. But that shows you that the movement in that direction could potentially be a good thing, not just on cost, but also long-term on the hope for quality. Obviously, insurance costs, that's a massive problem right now with the Affordable Care Act, with Obamacare, and what that means for everybody. So the continued negotiation and working hard to keep the costs contained are very important. I'm not here to say that collective bargaining is the only thing. You can do everything right with collective bargaining, and some districts are still going to have some problems. If you have a recession, your property values crash, or a plant shuts down, that your major thing, you can have issues still. So don't mistake me, don't assume that we do this and we're going to have that silver bullet. That's not what we're saying. I'm just trying to say that is one of the most important things that in a management sense a board can do to be as resilient as possible. Also, I do think it's important to point this out. We're working on a report that hopefully we'll have out early to the first quarter of next year. A lot of research shows the amount of money that's spent per pupil is not indicative of academic performance. There's always this inherent thought that the more you spend, the better your outcomes are going to be. We probably need to move away from it. There is a whole host of socioeconomic and cultural issues, especially in urban districts, but elsewhere too, that are incredibly impactful. And it doesn't matter what the amount of money you spend if you can't deal with some of these other things. You don't have the two-parent issue. Obviously, there's successes there, but we know that there's issues that emerge that way. So these are the things that we always need to be careful about and understand. It's not just a function of money. So we need to be very frugal about what we're doing, and we can also be more frugal and stronger in the negotiations when we realize that the money itself is not the primary driver in achievement. I believe that was my last slide. So, Greg at BuckeyeInstitute.org, that's my email. Our website is BuckeyeInstitute.org. I have some cards here. If anybody wants, I can hand out my cards, a handful of them. And then I will also be very happy to email you this presentation and everything else as well. So I don't think I have any time for any more questions.